Now on WRS, Michael McKay with the McKay Interview.
Hello everyone. In this mini-series devoted to the current pandemic, we've looked at the COVID-19 crisis from different angles and through a range of different prisms. With the help of experts, our level of understanding of the complexity of the crisis has been improved. At least I know mine has, and I hope yours has too. We've already examined the role of communication in time of national crisis and public health anxiety, like now, especially the role of the media in Switzerland and in the UK as just two examples. However, additionally, I thought it'd be interesting and useful to look at the psychology of persuading large groups of people, communities, and even nations to change their behavior and to do the bidding or take instructions or advice of government and public officials. To help me and all of you listening understand the behavioral psychology aspects of these anxious times, I've sought the advice of a professional based in the UK whose focus is on understanding why people do what they do and why they think the way they think. Jo Hemmings is my guest today. She's a celebrated behavioural psychologist, a registered member of the British Psychological Society and the Association of Clinical Psychologists, specialising in media and celebrity analysis, as well as being a dating and relationship coach, and on top of that, a TV and radio personality in her own right. Jo is the Consultant Psychologist on ITV's Good Morning Britain and This Morning, two British TV shows, and British listeners listening might be familiar with them, as well as the BBC, Channel 4, C4 and Sky News. She also helps behind the scenes in the contestant selection process by giving psychological advice and assessment to reality and TV producers and contestants. She's well known, being currently ranked as number 2 in the UK and number 17 in the world in the 30 most prominent psychologists on Twitter, as well as in the top 21 mental health doctors and therapists you should be following on Twitter. Today, the 26th of June, she's speaking to me via Zoom from her home in England. Hello, Jo. Welcome to the McKay Interview. I'm delighted to meet you, and many thanks for making time for me.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for inviting me onto the show. I'm looking forward to it.
It's really a great privilege to have you on the show. Jo, I have lots of questions, and I'm curious to hear your answers. So I'm going to dive straight in. Here's the first one. What, in your opinion, are the essential components that people in authority, let's start with political leaders, need to understand and incorporate into their policies, their strategies, actions, words, and even tone in order to get their citizens to take their advice, even though that advice may, on the face of it, be unpalatable, and to do as they're told willingly?
Well, okay, so this is the first experience we've ever really had of this situation. And I think what's come out unexpectedly is that clarity and consistency are both key features in enabling people to be compliant. So that's clarity and consistency in both words and behavior. So, for example, we understood stay home as a very clear message. We knew what we had to do. Stay alert, which it then subsequently changed to, was a much more nebulous term. Now that creates a problem, and we didn't really understand quite what that meant. And so, of course, in terms of behaviour, we had Cummings-gate, Dominic Cummings, chief advisor to the PM, who was found...
For the benefit of those who don't know him, just what did he do?
Chief advisor to the Prime Minister.
And he went off on some trip.
He was instrumental, first of all, in creating and implementing the lockdown rules.
Right.
Then seen to go off on a trip to Durham on his wife's birthday with a slightly spurious excuse as to why. And this was many times, and actually quite difficult to see where he could justify doing what he did. He was actually doing something illegal and certainly against lockdown principles. He didn't resign, he wasn't fired. And therefore people saw that as a sign of well, if it's one rule for them and one rule for us, and that, unfortunately, makes people less compliant. So if the words and the behaviour are not consistent, you already got an issue, or clear, you've already got an issue with compliancy.
So that's on the political side. Now let me flip the coin, Jo, because you've already led it into my second question, but let's go into it a little bit more deeply. How do people read, interpret, and react to the different ways of being told what to do by politicians or public officials in authority. And I have in mind, to be topical, some of the huge crowd scenes on some of England's beaches, which I saw on TV yesterday.
Yes, I mean, that's a really tough one, because of course now we are coming out of lockdown with an official date really for people to be able to go to beaches on the 4th of July. I mean, one of the ways we've delivered the message here is quite often, in fact, it's been on a Thursday evening, let's say, they will then say you can do X, Y, Z from the following Monday morning. But people have taken that as something they can do straight away. We've also been blessed or cursed, depending on how you want to look at it, by the most phenomenal summer weather.
Wonderful.
So far, which of course is wonderful for people to be able to get out, but perhaps not so wonderful for when so many people are going out. So I think an example of our public officials or our police, you know, we have always been, our police has always been associated with sort of being there, being a reassuring presence, but perhaps not getting directly involved unless there's a situation which threatens to get out of control. And one of the problems is because there's such a lot of complex rules. So these people in Bournemouth Beach, for example, they may have been going with every intention of social distancing in their little spots. But when you get hundreds of thousands of people going to the same place, however meaningful your intent was to socially distance, obviously it's physically impossible. It's quite hard, I think, for the police to enforce very much in those situations, because who do they choose? Who is breaking those rules? Some aren't, but other people around them are, and therefore they are all breaking them. So I do honestly think if this situation is to continue, probably the only option is to sadly close those beaches altogether.
I was going to say, I'm going to ask you not to put the police under the microscope, because it seems to me from this distance they're in an invidious position. But what do you think the police and others in authority ought to do, particularly the police, when they're the sort of meat in the sandwich on this case, in this case?
Well, they are. And the trouble is, one of the things we have needed so badly in the last 3 months are truth and trust. Now, I know these are not qualities necessarily associated with politicians, but they have been found to be lacking. We need them to have apologised when they've made an error or misjudged something. That will make us trust them more. I know there's a backdrop of evolving science, which has a huge impact, but it's not wholly responsible for plans going awry. And the problem is we then start to make up our minds. When the rules get too complex, we make up our own minds, and it's very difficult to say who is breaking what recommendation. And in fact, for people who have made up their minds, this is how they are going to be accountable, how they are going to behave, or whatever extreme that is, you can always find opinions, you can find division in scientific opinions that will back up your case. So when you've got a fairly divisive country in terms of what we should or shouldn't be following, actually very, very hard for people in authority to police the situation currently.
So if I try to summarize what you're saying in answer to that question, that essentially from a professional point of view within the science, there's a combination of anecdotal evidence and empirical evidence, and that the public, members of the public, will often dip into both in order to make up their own minds if the messages aren't clear. Is that a fair summary, or am I putting words into your mouth there, Joe?
Summary, I think once you've decided your behaviour will be in X fashion, it is very easy to find authoritative backup information.
Yes, that's true.
You are doing the right thing, which may be the opposite of what someone else is doing, who's also finding authoritative information to back up their behaviour. So, yeah, we're in a bit of an impasse in that respect, in terms of us moving as one socially cohesive public.
Yeah. Let's just turn to COVID-19. What happens, Joe, in your experience, what happens to people's thought processes and behavior when an invisible threat occurs, especially one with the unique risks of COVID-19? Tell me what your professional education and training informs you about the various ways that people, and we're talking about adults, not children, can change when confronted by this novel situation, which for many has put them or members of their family in mortal danger.
Yep, again, an unprecedented situation. But what you have is a combination of fear and uncertainty and a lack of control. They all breed anxiety. So what's happening to us physiologically and psychologically is that our cortisol and our adrenaline levels are rising. So cortisol is the hormone responsible for stress. Adrenaline is our fight or flight hormone. Now, normally we would be able to self-regulate these. We get a bit stressed, but we'll find another way of distracting ourselves and calming ourselves down. They have been running very high in very many people a great deal of the time. And that probably isn't diminishing very much at the moment. The other thing I think which dictates the way we think, the way we behave, is actually partly the experience we've all had in the last 12 weeks. How personal was it for you? Do you know someone who's been sick? Have you been sick? Do you know someone who's passed away? It's a personal experience which you interpret, which will dictate how you move forward. And it's also about whether you're risk averse or risk tolerant as a character. So people who are risk tolerant are much more likely to be going their own way and perhaps not taken a great deal of notice of what had been said up to now. And
that's a scientific and measurable characteristic, or just a notion that people can discuss in conversation?
It's a measurable.
It's measurable.
So people who are risk averse are going to be, generally speaking, the most compliant in any situation. They're going to have been guided by the government. They're going to have had that support of the state directing them in what to do. We don't have that now. Our daily briefings that we have from the government have stopped for now. And
yes, I noticed that.
Different stage of sort of easing of lockdown restrictions. And those people are going to feel quite unsupported and a bit confused because they now have to be accountable for their own behaviour. There are too many guidelines, they're very complex and it's quite difficult to follow. Whereas those people who are risk tolerant will be making hay while the sun shines.
Thank you. My guest today is Jo Hemmings, the well-known behavioural psychologist and British TV personality. And we're talking about human behaviour in these times of public health crisis and COVID-19, and speaking on Zoom between Switzerland and England. Jo, do you have any observations about the social psychology of coming out of the lockdown? We touched on this already in the conversation. For example, shopping, the reopening of schools, social distancing, and even the public celebrations of Liverpool winning the Premier League, which happened just yesterday.
It did. Look, again, you're going to get quite polarized behavior. It's very difficult to say that we're going to move as a cohesive social group. I mean, some people will embrace those freedoms as they happen. What I have noticed is that things that are opening, like McDonald's, for example, huge queues for McDonald's burger, but that's a very reassuring comfort food. You can go all the way around the world and a McDonald's is a McDonald's.
And that's how you see it. It's a reassuring sign.
Yes, it's something which really navigates their way through. Gosh, McDonald's is open, things must be okay.
Yeah.
Get that with a lesser known brand, for example. Other things are people need to take baby steps. I mean, even if you go back to very familiar places, for example, hairdressers are opening July the 4th.
But not beauty parlours, or beauticians, or whatever the word is, I've heard.
Not sure if they'll sneak in a bit of beauty into
okay.
that way. But what you're going to is a very familiar place with an unfamiliar setup.
Yes.
And that's going to make some people just wobble because you expect something to be the way that it was. We know that it might not be, but we don't know what it is till we go there and find out. And so, I don't think there are some who will absolutely rush to all these things as they happen, and others who will take it at a much more measured baby step pace. So by the time they've done one thing and it didn't feel too bad, they're able to step a little bit further out of the comfort zone that has been created in the last 3 months and begin to get back into whatever new normal life looks like more slowly.
I see. One last question, Jo, a little bit different, but I'm sure you'll understand why I'm asking this particular question. How do geography and population density affect human behavior? I mean, do people who live in rural areas behave differently from city or large town dwellers, from suburbanites, compared with those who dwell in high-rise flats, for example? Intuitively, I'd imagine that they do, as I draw from my own personal experience, having grown up in the English countryside. I don't know whether you're a town or a city or a countryside dweller yourself, but how do you as a professional psychologist see town versus country on this?
Well, I'm a London dweller.
You're a London dweller, okay.
And still live in London. So, what we saw localized charts of areas and what was happening during our daily government briefings. There are, the more dense areas of cities and towns are more likely to have people who are hyper aware simply because of their population of what's going on. We know that the virus thrives more in enclosed spaces, for example. So I think people who live in the country will probably feel to a degree that they are in a safer position. But of course, what's happening is people, not just Bournemouth Beach, but people going to beauty spots all over the countryside, those rural dwellers who think they're a bit safer are now they would normally welcome tourism perhaps, but now there's a fear of tourism because
they resent their presence.
Well, indeed, there's a belief that, all these city people are coming to, infect them potentially in their fairly safe rural havens. So we've got a bit of a mix of feelings going on, I think, there. Particularly Cornwall, for example, has been very highly hit by this. They depend hugely on tourism.
Yeah.
There's that conflict of interest of, yes, we want our hotels to open and our restaurants, but we're not sure we want people coming in when we feel relatively safe and making us feel less safe. So there's that going on, of course.
Jo, thanks so much for casting valuable light on some of these complicated facets, and thanks for your patience in explaining things to me and to our listeners. My guest today has been Jo Hemmings, the well-known British behavioural, I have problems with saying that word, behavioural psychologist. Thank you, Jo, very much for your time this morning.
That was the McKay Interview with Michael McKay. And don't forget, you can hear that interview again on our website, worldradio.ch.